Bienvenue à la réunion.
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to the 59th meeting of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights and the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting will take place in a hybrid format, and all the witnesses have carried out the required connection tests before the meeting. I'd like to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed through the chair. I'd ask members to raise their hands should they wish to speak, whether in person or via Zoom. The clerk of the subcommittee and I will do our best to keep the speaking order. Before we start with our witnesses today, I'd like to take a moment. Microphone, please, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to take a moment to draw my colleagues' attention to 4 budgets were distributed to the subcommittee members this morning. They authorise expenditures on the studies that the committee has decided to launch this fall. First, targeting civil society in Venezuela. Second, models of forced migration in different regions of the world. Third, implementing Canada's Universal Periodic Review. Fourth, transnational repression in developing democracies. Now, if members are ready to pass the 4 budgets, we can do so now. Otherwise, should members wish to have more time to review the budgets, we can come back to them next week. Is the subcommittee ready to adopt the budgets now?
All is good? Carried. Donc, je déclare le budget.
Carried. The budgets are carried. Now, pursuant to Standing Order 108.2 and the motion adopted by the subcommittee on September 24th, 2024, we're resuming our study on patterns of forced migration in different regions of the world. And I'd like to welcome our first panel of witnesses. Now, in a personal, individual capacity, we have Danielle Di Martino, Graduate Fellow, the Manhattan Institute, appearing by video conference. We also have Emmanuel Rincon, lawyer, by video conference. Then we have Oxfam Canada, Lauren Revon, Managing Director. You'll be given a maximum of 5 minutes for your speeches, after which we will open the floor to questions. Welcome Mr. Di Martino, Mr. Rincon, and Ms. Revon. I'd invite you to make your opening statements of no more than 5 minutes. And we'll start with you, Ms. Revon. The floor is yours for 5 minutes. Can you hear me? Good.
Thank you for inviting me here today on a topic that I think about every day of the week. My name is Lauren Ravon. I'm the Executive Director of Oxfam Canada. Every single day, families around the world are being forced from their homes in search of safety and a better life. They're risking everything to escape conflict, natural disasters, violence, or hunger, often leaving with nothing but the clothes on their backs. In my 10 years with Oxfam, I have witnessed forced displacement increase significantly. Last month, I visited Somalia, where I met with families who had fled their lands and were now living in makeshift tents on the outskirts of villages. Their living conditions were so precarious, and yet they knew they would never be able to return to their land. After 4 years of intense droughts, that land has been rendered uninhabitable. I also visited the border between Sudan and South Sudan. I remember standing on the main road that connects the 2 countries and seeing hundreds of people by the hour crossing over the border by foot under the beating sun. Almost all of these people were mothers and grandmothers with their kids. Many of them had been displaced twice, first seeking refuge in Sudan when the civil war broke out in their country, and then fleeing back as returnees after violence erupted in Khartoum. knowing very well the conditions aren't in place for their safe return, but left with no other choice. Forced migration is not a new phenomenon, but in recent years, its scope has expanded dramatically. There are now a staggering 120 million people who have been forcibly displaced around the world. The reason for this rise are complex and varied, whether it's the devastation caused by violent conflict, persecution, or the worsening impacts of climate change. People around the world are being driven from their homes in ever-increasing numbers. In Sudan, more than 10 million people have been displaced since the conflict broke out. It's the worst internal displacement crisis in the world today. 6.8 million people are internally displaced in the DRC, 2.9 million in Myanmar. About 1.9 million Palestinians have been displaced in the Gaza Strip, many forced to flee multiple times. And in all these contexts, the cause of displacement is conflict, and those who pay the price are civilians. Syrians account for almost 1 in 5 refugees globally, with 6.5 million Syrians hosted in 131 countries. More than 7.7 million Venezuelans have left their country over the last decade. This is the largest exodus in Latin America's recent history and one of the largest displacement crises in the world. In Central and South America, organized crime, economic hardship, and political corruption have left countless individuals with no choice but to embark on a dangerous journey north. Meanwhile, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, droughts, floods, and other environmental catastrophes have wiped out all livelihoods, leading to large-scale displacement as communities seek safety and sustenance elsewhere. In South Asia, the 2022 floods in Pakistan resulted in 8 million people being displaced. Oxfam, an organization with a long history in humanitarian work, has been at the forefront of responding to forced migration. Through our programs, we help people who have been displaced meet their basic needs, things like access to clean water, food, shelter, and safety. We're also working to address the underlying causes of forced migration, reducing poverty, conflict, and inequality. And this speaks to the need for long-term solutions that go beyond immediate humanitarian response. Forced migration is a global issue that demands a global response. Canada has been a leader in welcoming refugees to this country, and its commitment to providing safe haven for those in need is a source of national pride. And yet there's more that we can do collectively. So to conclude, I want to share 4 recommendations for the Government of Canada. Firstly, Canada should increase its levels of humanitarian aid. We should expand our support specifically to countries grappling with large internal displacement crises, as well as countries that are hosting large numbers of refugees, providing financial resources and technical assistance to help meet the needs of these populations. Secondly, Canada must recognize and address climate change as a driver of displacement. As climate change increasingly forces people to leave their homes, Canada should advocate for global action on climate migration and support policies that provide protections for climate refugees. Thirdly, Canada should champion international cooperation and work with international partners to improve the resettlement process, enhance legal pathways for migration, and ensure the human rights of all displaced people are upheld. And finally, the only way to stem the tide of forced migration is to promote sustainable development. Investing in long-term development programs in regions prone to forced migration can address some of the root causes, thereby reducing the needs for people to flee. Forced migration is not just a humanitarian crisis. It's a test of our collective humanity. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today.
Thank you, Madame Ravon. It was a great allocation. Yes, Mr.
Mon cher président, mon cas, peut-être demander aux témoins de parler.
Mr. Chairperson, whom I love so much, if I could ask the witnesses to speak a tad more slowly so that our interpreters can take a breather from time to time.
For all our witnesses, when they speak, to speak slowly a bit in order to give a chance for our people who do the good translation for us. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Mr. Daniel Martino to take the floor for 5 minutes, please. Mr. Martino, you could start.
Thank you for allowing me to testify about this very important matter. I hail from Venezuela, the nation that has produced the largest number of refugees and displaced persons in the world, numbering 9 million today. This is a shocking fact because Venezuela used to be the 4th richest country in the world, and it welcomed millions of immigrants in the second half of the 20th century, including my own 4 grandparents. Venezuela used to be the world's top oil exporter, yet it is now the top world's people exporter. It is the country with the largest oil reserves on the planet, yet there is no gasoline. I was forced to line up for food, medicines, and other necessities for hours as the government told me when I could visit the grocery store and what I could buy. Inflation destroyed my family's income and made us extremely poor. I lost power and water in my home frequently, and my childhood was plagued by fear of robbery, kidnapping, and murder amid rising crime. And unlike other refugee crises, the world's largest refugee crisis in Venezuela was not caused by a foreign invasion, an ethnic or a religious conflict, or a natural disaster. The world's largest refugee crisis was caused by socialism. The socialist policies of the initially democratically elected regime, such as nationalizations of businesses, price and currency controls, limitless government spending and deficits, turned my beautiful nation into a horrible and dangerous place. That is why Venezuelans flee. But it's not just Venezuelans. It's Cubans, it's Nicaraguans, it's Eritreans, it's North Koreans, and it's millions of other people today and in the past who have died, suffered, and fled from socialism. And it is not just socialism as well. Behind rising numbers of refugees, authoritarian regimes of many ideologies and their actions are why most of the world's refugees have fled. Think of Syria, Russia, and China. The question before you now is what to do about this. I'd like to suggest two sets of actions. First is to attack the causes of the refugee crisis, and that means taking a stand against evil. You should stop allowing authoritarian regimes to take advantage of you to enrich themselves. For example, Canada continues to trade and enrich the Cuban regime in the hopes that this is the best course of action with the oldest and most evil dictatorship in our region. Instead of maintaining normal relations with Cuba, an ethical and smart approach is to take a stand against evil and support the Cuban people, not the regime, by, for example, helping to provide free satellite internet on the island and funding the democratic resistance. I think this boils down to a simple question, which is that if you knew your neighbor was kidnapped in his house, what would you do? Would you call the police? Would you try to save him if there was no police? This is the situation that afflicts well over 1 billion people around the world. They are kidnapped by tyrants, and it is our moral duty to help them. Advancing freedom abroad is even more important because you simply can't welcome all of the world's refugees, and they would rather stay in their home countries with freedom than go to Canada. Second, you must have a rational and effective refugee policy that picks the right number and the right kind of refugees and helps those refugees succeed. My research with the Manhattan Institute on Immigrant Assimilation and its fiscal impact in the US has many lessons applicable to Canada. First is that the immigrants who are most likely to succeed economically are those who speak the language of their new home country and are more highly educated, as well as arrive as children or young adults. These are also the immigrants who tend to pay more taxes than receive benefits from the government. Selecting refugees who are younger, speak English or French, and are more educated means you can welcome more of them at no cost. Canada has a successful, privately run refugee program sponsorship, but a recent explosion in asylum claims and government-funded refugee sponsorship threatens the long-admired Canadian immigration model. Excessively high numbers of less selected immigrants lead to a strain in public resources and housing that Canadians are now feeling and complaining about. Canada has already taken a good step to fix this by reimposing visa requirement on Mexicans, but you can't continue by limiting government-funded refugee sponsorship and relying more on private sponsorship. Subcommittee members, I have met countless refugees, especially in my role as founder of the Dissident Project, my organization that sends immigrants from countries ruled by tyrants to speak at American high schools to tell their stories. I view refugees as an asset too, an asset to democracy. And you should use the stories of the thousands of people who fled tyranny to Canada to educate young Canadians about the privilege of living in a free country. The best thing you can do for refugees is to honor the promise of freedom in Canada for you and for the world, and not to let your nation turn into another place to flee like it happened to mine. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Señor Martino. Thank you, Monsieur Martino. Now I would like to invite Mr. Emmanuel Rincon to take the floor for 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours, Mr. Rincon.
Thank you very much. Parliament. Thank you for having me. Today, we see the effect of the mass migration in the Western world and why we are facing this enormous crisis.
Still, excuse me, can you hold? We have a technical issue. We would like to check it, please.
No problem.
It was decided that we are going to the first round of question with the first two witnesses, and then our IT team will be in contact with him trying to solve the problem. So maintenant, je vais maintenant ouvrir le débat pour les
Debate, questions and answer period.
Mr. Ali Ehsasi. Ali, you have the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Great to have you back, Ms. Ravin. I saw a report a few days ago, which was issued by the UN, and essentially it was saying in an era of indiscriminate warfare that we're currently experiencing, that they had found that 40% of the people who had died in war zones were women. So how common is this? This is certainly a new trend. I think this report was saying that the number of women who are dying in various countries due to indiscriminate warfare has doubled within a year. So what do you think the ramifications of this will be? And how do we address this issue?
Can you hear me? This is working. Thanks. No, thank you for that question, and it's definitely something that we're observing. The fact that more and more wars are being fought in densely populated urban areas in particular, huge impact on civilians. To be honest, kind of a disrespect for international humanitarian law. That means that more civilians overall are being hit, not only women, civilians in general, but in particular women and their kids are dying more. I would also say that something that is less covered but equally worrying is that many more women than men die in humanitarian disasters, natural disasters. And I don't think this is a well-known fact. And as humanitarian disasters caused by natural catastrophes that are climate-driven are on the rise. We're going to see more and more women dying in particular. This is often because women have less mobility than men. So, for example, they're the ones who are less likely to be able to leave their home. They're first to be caring for their elderly father, their kids, so are not getting to safety in time. And as the number of floods, kind of hurricanes, violent storms are happening, we're seeing more women dying. And so something that we've been really advocating for is more investment in women being able to prepare communities for the worst case scenario so that they are actually involved. We see that when women aren't involved in preparing for the worst happens to them first. And so women not being involved in natural or national disaster preparedness plans means that decisions are made that are based on men's ability to flee or to prepare, not women. So both in conflict and in natural disasters, women are definitely bearing the brunt today.
Absolutely. And then you made a number of really good recommendations. I was wondering if I could just focus on the last one, which was promoting sustainable development for countries to essentially be focused on that. How prevalent is that for European and North American countries to promote sustainable development?
I mean, it seems self-evident that if people have good living conditions, are less at risk of a natural disaster, actually have access to jobs, that they'll want to stay in their country. Most people have no intention of leaving their homes. They don't want to leave their homes. But we're seeing that with kind of the rise of conflicts and of climate-induced disasters, a lot of international aid is going to humanitarian response. And our concern at Oxfam, and that we're experiencing ourselves, and that there's a bottoming out of financing for development work. So we're running from one emergency to the next, kind of putting a Band-Aid on and then going to the next place. And then ultimately the programs that invest in, job creation, technical and vocational training, women's empowerment, climate-smart agriculture, all those things are no longer being invested in because all we're doing is rushing around, kind of trucking in water, emergency food aid, emergency cash distribution, not investing in what keeps people kind of safe and healthy and at home. And I am concerned about trends I'm seeing where, first of all, global solidarity with countries that are being hit by disasters is strained. Development budgets aren't growing around the world by any stretch. But on top of it, the fact that we have so many emergencies means that more and more money is going to humanitarian causes, which we need. But if you're not doing both in tandem, we're just kind of chasing our tail. And we've talked a long time, and I think I've spoken with many of you about this before, the need to fund across the humanitarian development peace nexus. And what that means is that we need to be connecting the dots. So when we're going into a community that's been hit by an emergency, we're not only trucking in water for today, we're building, for example, solar panel desalination plants in that community so that they will have access to water in the long term. It means also that we stop seeing efforts to empower women as non-life-saving and therefore non-fundable under humanitarian programs, which is currently is the case. Humanitarian program definitions are very narrow, so any work that has to do with gender equality, women's empowerment does not meet the definition, can't get funded. So if we got rid of these strict barriers between what we consider as humanitarian response, long-term development, and then peace-building efforts, we could have a more seamless integration of the work that we do. I'll give one example that I might have shared with you in the past. Oxfam has supported a really interesting program funded by the Government of Canada, a Women's Voice and Leadership program in Pakistan. The whole purpose of the program was to build up the capacity of local women's groups to be advancing their communities, whether it's economic development, justice, women's political participation. When the floods hit in Pakistan, many of these organizations that we were working with said, we want to be part of the humanitarian response, and yet we weren't able to use the funding that we had for programming for these organizations to allow them to do humanitarian response. The line is so rigidly drawn that that would have required a whole new renegotiation of our programming. And that's because the way that development funding is generally set up is that it has this clear delineation. And you can't move from one to the next. So we're really recommending that at Global Affairs Canada, we have two things. One, more funding across that nexus of development and humanitarian. And secondly, we include things that we refer to as crisis modifiers. So basically, when you develop a project, you already know that something is likely going to go wrong so that you anticipate that. So in a country that's prone to flooding, for example, within your development program, you have crisis modifiers to say, if flooding hits the region where the programs are happening, then we'll pivot to these sorts of activities rather than having to go back to the drawing board.
Thank you very much.
That's done 1 minute.
Yeah, I'm good.
That's okay. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Mr. Majumdar to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for your perspectives on dealing with this. Mr. Di Martino, I wanted to talk a little bit about what your colleague from Oxford had raised. She said that in your home country of 1.7 million Venezuelans are internally displaced, and that crime and corruption broadly across the Americas are fueling a refugee crisis. I wanted to spend a little bit of time, sir, focusing on the kind of actors that animate this refugee crisis. You had a chance to talk a little bit about the failed socialist experience in Venezuela. I'm curious, when it comes to how countries like Canada engage with Venezuela, Cuba, and other authoritarian regimes in the Americas, what would be a better way to uphold principles of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in a way that would restrain the refugee crisis rather than exacerbate it?
Yeah, so I think that in general there's this misconception that these countries like Cuba or Venezuela have become poorer as a consequence of sanctions, when in reality what's happened is that the economies have been bankrupted by the governments themselves. And the best example of that is what happened in Venezuela, which is that when actually the whole Western world sanctioned Venezuela and its government, the government was actually forced to dollarize the economy, and most of the population now uses US dollars, Colombian pesos, and inflation actually fell. It didn't go up as a consequence of international sanctions. And so the purpose of the sanctions should either be, well, we want to either dislodge this government or we want to contain their capacity to do harm. And what is a capacity to do harm? They use foreign currency to buy weapons to repress our people. They use international currency and trade with China and ties with other authoritarian regimes to fund terrorist organizations. There are Hezbollah ties with the Venezuelan government, just as with the Cuban. There are guerrilla groups working from Colombia and Venezuela that are funded by the Venezuelan regime. And those terrorist groups, guerrilla groups, fuel more refugees from other countries. And so you want to starve these governments from funding so that they stop doing harm, and understand that they are not governments but criminal organizations that occupy a territory. And the way to help the population is a different way. So, for example, with the Venezuelan people, Canada has done a lot to allow for Canadians to sponsor Venezuelans and come to Canada as refugees. So have other countries. A different way to help the internal population is to, people have mentioned humanitarian aid. I think the best way is actually to facilitate international transactions. So how can we allow the Venezuelan people to access US dollars rather than the domestic currency so that they can escape inflation? How can we provide internet access and access to information so that democratic leaders within the country can make change? I think that that's the kind of thinking we need to have.
And when you look at how Canada, the United States, and others are acting in Venezuela today as the pressure continues, do you think that more can be done to recognize those forces of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, than has presently been done?
Well, the biggest issue is that Canada continues to trade with Cuba. Canadians continue to visit Cuba as if it was a normal country, and thinking that this is going to stimulate the economy. And I mentioned Cuba specifically because the sanctions policy and really international relations of Canada and Cuba is very different from Canada and Venezuela. Canada has taken a strong stand in favor of freedom in Venezuela, while it has not for Cuba. And that matters because actually the reason the Venezuelan regime stays in power is because of Cuban spies and support from the Cuban regime in the island. And so they're one and only, they are the same transnational organization. The Cubans receive oil and the Venezuelans receive Cuban spies. And this is widely reported. And so this matters because a lot of people believe that, for example, Canadian tourists in Cuba will help the Cuban people, when in reality the Cuban government keeps all of the proceeds and pays a misery salary of $1 a day to the Cuban worker that is actually in those hotels. And so you're not actually stimulating the economy of Cuba, you're stimulating the regime. And that's really unethical this is even beyond just the economics, this is just about ethics here.
And when you think about how the northern part of the hemisphere deals with refugee pressures coming from the southern part of the hemisphere, how do we have better tools to try and differentiate between screening out the oppressor, the criminal, the dictator, the trafficker, and spending more time on finding ways to help marginalized people succeed at starting a new life?
I think that the best people who will be able to know who were the people involved in these regimes when they are coming into a freer country like Canada is other people from that country. And so if you're going to screen Venezuelan refugees, you likely need input from other Venezuelans who are already in the country. And this is why so many people who say we're part of the Cuban Communist Party or the Venezuelan Socialist United Party, people who distributed food and withheld food aid for political reasons in Venezuela, who have been able to get to the US or get to Canada, they have been able to get through because there were no other Venezuelan or Cuban immigrants who were paying attention and looking at those files. It's much more likely that people from those countries will know who is involved in the criminal activity than people from other places.
I think we have 30 seconds left for a quick question. So let me just ask, sustainable development was a topic that's been raised today, and I'm sure will be raised many times after. In 15 seconds or so, how important is establishing the rule of law, free markets, and actual capitalism as being an antidote to the type of socialist failures we're experiencing across this hemisphere?
Yeah, humanitarian aid is not going to solve the world's refugee crisis. It almost all goes to consumption spending. That's bread for today, hunger for tomorrow. The only way to solve the refugee crisis is to have economic growth, and humanitarian aid has never pulled a country from poverty to rich. It has only been economic freedom.
Thank you, Mr. Majumdar. And now, j'aimerais inviter Monsieur Brunel Duceppe à prendre la...
Mr. Brunel Duceppe.
On va suspendre quelques...
We're going to suspend for a couple of seconds to do a sound test. Chairperson. Now, the interpreter is asking that the witness not speak too quickly. Thank you very much.
So, okay. I would like to invite you to take the floor for 5 minutes, but please don't speak that fast. Take it slowly a little bit. Okay. Go ahead,
no
please.
Problem. Okay. As we speak, there are millions of people abandoning their home countries, leaving their homes, their families, only for the purpose of finding liberties, jobs, rule of law, and in particular, to have the opportunity to have a life. We've been told that the only reason why these people are moving around, it is because of the lack of opportunity. And that is true. But what we haven't heard at least, not in a proper way, are the causes for this to happen. I'm from Venezuela, a country that used to be one of the most richest countries in the world. In fact, in the past century, we get to be in the top 5 of the nation with the higher GDP per capita, way above higher from Canada. And now we are one of the most miserable economies in the world. More than 80% of our people live in poverty. The minimum wage are $3.5 per month. And this means that there are teachers, doctors, and other professionals that are earning less than $50 per year. And this was supposedly a way forward to achieve equity thanks to socialism. So if we're going to speak about the causes of mass migration and refugees, we need to talk about the political systems that are causing the collapse of various nations all over the world. According to the Organization of American States, based in the data of United Nations, Venezuela is right now the country with the most refugees all over the world. We got more people fleeing the country than Ukraine, Syria, and even Afghanistan. Countries that are facing right now invasions and civil wars. So this means that more people are abandoning at this moment a country that used to be one of the most prosperous countries in the world because of a socialist system that delivered all the powers to the state, supposedly for the well-being of the people, and turned into a dictatorship has already happened a lot of times in the course of history. Venezuela has right now 8 million people outside of the territory. That is more than 25% of our entire population. And we could populate 2 times a country like Uruguay with this amount of people. So what we need to do now? Of course, we have to eliminate all kinds of wars in the world, and also fight against any totalitarian regime that are collapsing our societies. The past week, the Maduro regime killed an opposition leader named Edwin Santos. He was the father of 2, and the dictatorial regime killed him only because he was one of the people that worked to make sure that all the votes in the past election in Venezuela were counted. Now his wife is alone with 2 children in a country without opportunities, without jobs, without proper salaries, and no rule of law. So in an environment like this, how can you expect that people doesn't try to escape? If we really want to fight against mass migrations, against the accumulation of millions of people all over the world in a refugee state, in condition of vulnerability, we need to be fighting against the root causes of this crisis, at least in our hemisphere. We are talking right now about Venezuela, but the same can be said about Cuba or Nicaragua. The past July 28, millions of people voted in Venezuela for a change, despite all the violations and abuse of power. Millions of people say that wanted a free Venezuela, a democratic system. We show the world that we won. We present the ballots that prove that Edmundo González won the presidential election. And despite that, there are numerous countries all over the world that right now are refusing to accept and recognize González as a re-elected president. And Canada is one of those countries too. So I will kindly ask if this sovereign, enormous, and respected country really want to fight against dictatorship, mass migration, and the suffering of millions of people all over the world to recognize González as our president. And not only make the recognition, but also to lead a coalition of countries to make sure that the vote of the Venezuelan people is respected. If you choose to be neutral in situations of injustice, you are de facto choosing the side of the oppressor. If you're watching your neighbor torturing their children, killing their family, and you do nothing, you are being complicit of the crime. So, and please pardon me, I don't want to sound disrespectful, but if we really want to achieve something with this meeting, we should focus on really act and just not to pretend to do it. We can really change the world. Canada, the United States, the European Union can really do something to change the life of millions of people all over the world. The only thing that we need is to have the political will to do it. If the developed countries want to really help the people of the third world nations to have an opportunity to live better, the answer is not to accept them all in their countries. The real answer is to fight to protect freedom and democracy in these nations. And in that way, make sure that in first place, the people doesn't have the necessity of abandoning their homeland. I know that it is not easy, and not all the countries have the same situation. But in the case of Venezuela...
Can you wrap it out, please? Time is out. Can you wrap it out, please?
I'm going to finish right now. You can really right now stop the refugee crisis, but only recognize democracy and fight with millions of Venezuela to put in charge the government that the majority has already chosen. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Señor Rincon. Thank you.
Gracias.
J'invite Monsieur Brunel Duceppe à prendre la
I'd call on Mr. Brunel Giuseppe to take the floor for 7 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here for this highly important study. Ms. Ravon, I'd just like to put things in context first. When it comes to, well, we've heard a lot to date at this committee, but when we hear about the source of waves of migration based on the regimes that are in place, isn't it true that it's often regimes where there's no democracy, not necessarily leftist or far left or far right regimes, but it's the pure lack of democracy, politically speaking, that can be a source of flows of migration? Response. Thank you very much for the question.
Number of causes of displacement. So just bringing it back to who is the kind of political leader of the day, authoritarian or not, is one cause, but it's one cause among many. I think for us, it's a kind of a triangle. It's poverty, it's kind of stability around the democratic process, and then it's climate-induced catastrophes. This is, what we're seeing. And then now conflict, is piling on top of that. So we can't reduce it to one cause, but we know that countries that have political stability, that have economic stability, that have kind of social safety nets, that have employment opportunities, that have kind of sense of security. This is what creates the conditions for people to stay put. This is why people stay home. They don't flee. Not all of that is caused by political leaders of the day, but a democratic society where people have a say in how decisions are made and how government funds are spent, in particular on public services, makes a huge difference. And so investing in public services is something that we advocate for. It's obviously much easier to do in a democratic regime, but I wouldn't say that everything has to do with politics. Today, climate-induced disasters can hit any country. We are being hit in Canada. We see the forest fires, the debilitating smoke, flooding, in Quebec where I live. We have a democracy, and we're still being hit by climate crises that will eventually cause displacement in our own country. So as we look at kind of the causes of the migration crisis, we need to understand they're complex, but the only way to answer them is to invest in sustainable development. That means, in some contexts, climate-smart agriculture. In other contexts, building codes that are resilient to natural disasters. In others, it's in youth vocational training, where we have a huge youth population and not enough employment opportunities. In many countries, and actually I should say in every context, investing in gender equality. We know that countries that have more gender equality are also more stable and are less likely to be contributing to global displacement crises. So it's a complicated answer, but it's a complicated problem, and I think if we want to be addressing it, we need to be looking at that interplay between democratic development, sustainable development, humanitarian aid when necessary, and peace building. And one last thing maybe on that, on peace building, we hear so few women's voices in peace building efforts, and if women are not involved in those processes, they're less likely to hold in the long run, and again, contributing to fuel this cycle of crisis, war, and displacement.
Vous avez parlé d'un...
You spoke in your recommendations, I think it was the third recommendation, if I'm correct, and you were calling on Canada to take a leadership role to bring as many countries as possible together in these efforts. And you're an expert when it comes to immigration. There have been a lot of waves of immigration over the years whilst you've worked at Oxfam. And Canada is not a military power, it's not an economic heavyweight. However, and I'm saying this as a Quebec sovereigntist, of course, but Canada has a history of sorts when it comes to advocacy for human rights and leadership and peace building. Mulroney, Lester B. Peterson, and many other main heads of state who've had a huge role to play on the world stage. Is it your sense that over recent years Canada's star has fallen a tad, or do you feel, if that's not the case, that Canada is having a lesser impact on the world stage in terms of the leadership role that we can play when it comes to the welfare of immigrants and refugees?
democratically elected leaders that are willing to speak up on issues of human rights, global security issues. We need more. There's not that many voices. I wouldn't speak specifically to Canada not being sufficiently a leader. I would say we're not hearing that many leaders on the global stage that are actually advancing a human rights agenda, advancing an agenda on international humanitarian law. There aren't that many voices. And there's kind of a distrust of multilateral systems. There's an increasing distrust in UN processes. And so we need more voices that are speaking out on these issues. That kind of vacuum of discourse on fundamental principles around gender equality, human rights, the rights of refugees, and not demonizing people that are on the run, but actually speaking up in their defense is really critical. So I say there's definitely more room for Canada to be speaking up. And at a time when, if you look across the G7, the G20, there aren't many leaders who are really speaking out in defense of principles that I think most Canadians would really cling to, that we believe in. We see ourselves as a country that was built on various waves of migration, and a welcoming country, expressing that at a time where there's rising xenophobia, when there's this, populist trends that are fueling fear of people that are going to be coming to our borders, that's very harmful. So yes, there's room for Canada, certainly.
Je vais essayer d'aller peut-être un peu plus.
Well, let me turn to something concrete. You've spoken at length about the global migration crisis. Now, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, Central America, this flow of migrants through to the United States. Are you aware of how things play out when it comes to people moving along that corridor? And what of the women and children who cross entire continents from the south to the north? 30 seconds, please, in response.
There's two things being covered by the international community in that very dangerous migration trail. One are care responsibilities. So women who are left alone to care for family members, for children, as men are leaving their community.
On a point of order, please start again. There was no interpretation.
Merci.
Yeah, should I go ahead? So two things. We're seeing that in many communities, men are migrating and women are left alone to care for children, elderly. And so there's a big care crisis. So it's like really on women's shoulders, having to hold entire societies afloat as men are migrating outside of communities. And the second trend that we're seeing is that women on this migration trail are at incredible risk of sexual violence. This is something that's underreported and not sufficiently covered in terms of the humanitarian services along that very dangerous migration corridor.
Thank you, Madame Ravon. Thank you, Mr. Brunet-Desseb. I invite Mr. John Gore-John to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Well, first, I just want to thank all the witnesses for testifying, certainly Ms. Ravon for the work that Oxfam does, and all of the people involved in Oxfam for the humanitarian work that you do to save lives every day. I really appreciate it. Now, I'm going to follow up on Mr. Brunet-Desseb. He talked about the important role Canada played when it comes to stability, security, and human rights and peace building. We think about Lester, B. Pearson. You want to know about Peace Prize. I know that there's actually a Peace Train Canada group leaving from the West Coast coming to Ottawa in November, and they're calling for the restoration of a Pearson Peace Center, to reopen, and the important role that played in developing capacity and having conversations. People from far away as Banfield and Port Alberni in my community that are coming, and their vision is that Canada becomes an independent middle power again, investing in promoting a culture of peace and resisting the culture of war. And they cite a few things, recognizing Canada's historical and present involvement in injustice and colonialism, and asymmetrical power structures here and abroad, and working towards true reconciliation, but also identifying the underlying causes of human conflict and violent conflict, and upholding the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The basics of justice, equality, freedom, security, and the well-being for all is essential for preventing violent conflict and war, and expanding Canada's role in the United Nations peacekeeping, and prioritizing open and informed public and parliamentary debate. And they call on the government to actually establish and fund a Centre of Excellence for Peace and Justice, focused on research, education, training in conflict resolution, diplomacy, and peacekeeping operations for Canadian civilians, police, military personnel, and the international community. Do you think this would be important for us to look towards?
So thanks. I don't know anything about this specific initiative, so I wouldn't speak to that. I think what would be important for Canada to do is to better connect the dots between the ways we are in the world. So between the way we conduct trade, our diplomacy, our humanitarian aid, our development work, and defense as well, that right now it feels quite disconnected, different ways in which Canada shows up in the world, and connecting the dots, knowing that we're safer if the global community is healthier, that our diplomacy can advance some of this work. It doesn't only have to be through aid dollars or through humanitarian response. And what I would want to see Canada is have more coherence across the trade, diplomacy, development, humanitarian spectrum.
I appreciate that. Obviously, they're advocating for the reopening of this centre to create dialogue to support that important work. Now, you spoke about the unique risks that women and girls face in situations of forced displacement and the horrific stats that you shared with us earlier. What measures can be taken to address those risks both on the ground and in refugee camps and on transit routes and through international frameworks that you can make recommendations to this committee?
So a lot more can be done. We as Oxfam have concerns around the way humanitarian aid is delivered. As I mentioned before, anything that has to do with advancing women's rights, gender equality, specifically having programs focused for women in humanitarian response, are not generally deemed eligible for funding because they're not perceived as life-saving. And so a widening either of the definition of how we understand humanitarian aid or building in kind of that joint approach where you could have programs supporting women's empowerment and equality alongside humanitarian initiatives. Right now, humanitarian response has a very narrow focus on protection, but that doesn't build up a more equal society after the humanitarian response has passed. And so widening it up, at Oxfam we do work on gender and emergencies. That can be allowing women to be involved in local committees determining how aid is going to be spent. It can mean kind of skills training so that they are actually participating in water initiatives and learning how women themselves can be maintaining boreholes after an international organization like Oxfam has built them, that they can be involved in long-term maintenance. All of that is so disconnected right now from the way we fund humanitarian work, and so we don't get the full kind of impact of what we could. Canada is a generous humanitarian funder, but by divorcing the two, we're running after our tail. We're going from one emergency to the next, especially because we see that in cases of whether it's a natural disaster or a war, women's rights backtrack. This is systematic. We lose ground on gender equality. And so in the world that we're living in today, we're likely to see a significant backsliding if we don't make those investments.
Thanks so much for that. According to the UNHRC, Lebanon, as we know, is going through this terrible conflict, and they're hosting the largest number of refugees per capita per square kilometer around the world, including approximately 1.5 million Syrian refugees. Can you maybe provide an update on the current situation in Lebanon and how it has led to the forced displacement of both Lebanese people and refugees and migrants already living in Lebanon, and maybe what Canada can do to respond to this growing humanitarian crisis at this time?
Thanks for raising Lebanon in particular. Well, first, I would say that the Government of Canada has been very helpful in having a match contribution with both members of the Humanitarian Coalition that Oxfam is a part of and the Red Cross in matching Canadian donations to the humanitarian response in Lebanon. So that's fantastic. And I really want to highlight how effective the match is, because we're seeing right now in Canada, people do not know about the crisis that people are experiencing in Lebanon. I will tell you, frankly, this has been one of the hardest humanitarian emergencies to fundraise for in our recent history as Oxfam. And the reason why is that people tend to give less for humanitarian response when it's a country hit by a war. So people tend to give more generously when people are struggling with a drought or a flood or a hurricane or any other natural disaster. And people tend to only hear on the news talk of the belligerents and the bombs and the militants. So we hear kind of the geopolitical side of the story, the politics behind the conflict in Lebanon, but we don't hear much about a mom who's trying to keep her kids alive, of people who are literally living in public parks in Beirut today because they have nowhere to get shelter. So whether you're a family that is hit by a drought or a war, if you can't feed your kids, you can't feed your kids. And I think that having the government help organizations like Oxfam get the message out and tell Canadians how badly Lebanese people today are suffering, it's very helpful because we are struggling to get that attention. There's definitely donor fatigue. People feel like the world is on fire and it's hard to know where to give and when to give, but suffering is real, and whether it's because of war or something else, if you've lost a limb, if your child has died of hunger, if you have nowhere to sleep at night, the problem is the same for you. And so we need the government to help us get the word out, and the match contributions for members of the Humanitarian Coalition is extremely, extremely helpful to us. So I am thankful for that.
Thank you, Mr. Guillaume. Thank you, Madame Ravon. I would like to thank Madame Ravon, Mr. Martineau, Mr. Rincon for your testimony, a great one, really. Thank you for your participation. Yes, please.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Rincon, we got the tech issues figured out, and then only 2 parties even had a chance to ask him a question, neither did. Could we at least offer him the opportunity, I don't know if this would work for him, but to hold on to take questions in the second round if anybody has questions for him? He doesn't have to do another opening statement, but, well, that would be but if one of us wants to ask a question of him using our time, we should have the ability to do so.
Yes. So
you don't have to.
So you agree, Mr. Lincoln, to stay for the other part of the meeting? And if some member would like to ask you a question, to be ready to answer?
It's okay with me.
Okay, thank you. No problem. So thanks also for your participation in this important study. If you would like, or if you feel you have some other information to share it with the committee, please feel free to write to the clerk. Thank you. We suspend for 2 seconds for testing now. on commence la réunion, s'il vous plaît, j'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue à notre deuxième groupe de témoins.
I want to welcome our second group of witnesses, Mr. Alexander Waxman, expert for the displaced persons as well as refugees.
Saharienne en Afrique du Nord, au Moyen.
North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeastern Europe with UN humanitarian agencies. The Canadian Council for Refugees, Laurent Lallemand, Co-Executive Director, by video conference today. From Doctors Without Borders, Jason Nickerson, Humanitarian Representative to Canada. 5 minutes max per person for your opening remarks, please. After which, there'll be a question and answer period. Welcome, Mr. Waxman, Ms. Lallemand, Mr. Nickerson. I'd call on you to make your opening remarks, maximum 5 minutes apiece, please. First, Mr. Alexander Waxman, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Committee members, it's an honor to be invited to speak today. I will situate what I consider an event horizon in terms of migration, IDPs, and refugees to you from my vantage point as a protection and child protection expert working at the front lines of major humanitarian responses.
Excuse me, can you speak slowly a little bit in order to give a chance for our interpreter?
No problem,
Okay,
and they have a copy of this. From my vantage point as a protection and child protection expert, working the front lines of major humanitarian responses over 12 years for UNICEF and UNHCR. The three prime drivers of IDP and refugee flows include deleterious socioeconomic conditions and poor overall governance in countries across sub-Saharan Africa, MENA, and Asia, causing people to seek economic betterment, which is in turn tied to seeking asylum and refugee status in favorable host countries like Canada, Western Europe, and Scandinavia. Crisis protraction is another cause of internal and external movement, as most crises on the global map are human-driven, lasting years, decades, or even generations. Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Yemen are prime examples of these conflicts. Climate change is an ever-increasing driver. Desertification, longer, harsher heat waves, and a paucity of water infrastructure are motivators in this regard and will continue to be as climate change worsens. The Lake Chad Basin crisis is emblematic of this. Migration is, as I have stated, an event horizon upon us, a term borrowed to describe the point when nothing escapes the gravitational pull of a black hole. Similarly, a plurality of crises will worsen from unaddressed socioeconomic change in vulnerable nations alongside climate deterioration, driving more to be on the move, and the ability to respond with agility to movements will be lost with the economic burden increasingly placed on countries like ours. Humanitarian funding for UN agencies is an annual one, known as the Humanitarian Program Cycle, or HPC, which donor countries like ours fund and is as outmoded as the post-war documents which created many UN agencies. Nearly all crises today are protracted, and durable funding streams need to be deployed with expert staff to enforce structural change aimed at handing over responses, especially IDP situations, to local authorities to manage. Too often, local governments do little on the response side, leaving humanitarian feeding, shelter, protection, etc., up to the UN and international NGOs. The nature of the HPC cycle means technical experts are hired once funding is secured, then deployed in country after months of bureaucracy worthy of Franz Kafka. If one is lucky, we get 6 or 8 months to respond to the crisis on the ground. This leads to local actors and government to view UN agencies as fickle. Meanwhile, UN agencies use half-started or poorly conceived projects as statistical successes in terms of numbers they reach to justify further funding extensions. The same goes for international and local NGO vassals on the ground who execute the grunt work of UN projects. Most of them are poorly staffed or managed and wait to see if they will get funds from UN agencies to retain staff or not. So, cooking the books, excuse that term, to make it seem that there are large needs is an incentive to ensure contract extensions. Strategies for changing this paradigm, such as the grand bargain localization strategy, are highly problematic as they favor direct funding to local NGOs, so-called longos. These longos are managed by persons with little to no financial acumen, staff who constantly turn over, and are not well trained in international humanitarian practices. So the risk of wasted donor money is high in this regard. There are major mandate replications inside the UN system, and I will use child protection as a singular example. Just one subset of child protection, called family tracing and reunification, is mandated to UNICEF, UNHCR, the IOM, and ICRC simultaneously. Each agency has its own internal databases of cases and do not share them among themselves, citing data privacy, when, in reality, each is trying to maintain domain dominance to justify continued funding. Yet on the ground, this means families and children are often confused as to who is handling a case, and the tracing process gets gummed up in UN bureaucracy and interagency rivalry. So families and children turn to informal channels like smugglers as a solution, making them more vulnerable. There are major flaws in UN human resourcing, especially at UNHCR and UNICEF. At UNHCR, RSD adjudicators, refugee status determination that is, in the field, often have no law degrees, yet are assessing asylum or resettlement claims that ultimately come to our shores based on flimsy interview work, out-of-date country of origin research, and little
Can you wrap it up, Mr. Waxman, because 10
I
more
have
seconds.
about 4 more bullet points, sir, if you wouldn't mind. That'd be fine, okay? Moreover, UNHCR can and does outsource its RSD mandate to other agencies with even less expertise and oversight, such as the DRC. Data-driven needs assessments, ostensibly which are nationwide statistical exercises, are incompletely done. UNICEF's Global Education Cluster, for example, in Geneva, a contractor with merely a degree in English literature living in Panama, is designated to lead global trainings on statistical exercises because they are the spouse of a senior UN education officer themselves. How can we expect data to be accurate when non-data scientists are at the helm owing to nepotism? I'll conclude with my last 2 points. Most refugee claims are socioeconomic in nature and not rooted in the grounds of the 51 Convention, which stipulates conferring refugee status due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group. As such, asylum seekers here in Canada and those abroad processed by UNHCR massage their claims to include elements in commonly accessible country of origin reports to substantiate their case in a tick-the-box fashion. I have submitted this document, which I will stop now, and you can refer to it yourselves, and the traductrice or traducteur can share that with you. I welcome any questions, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. And now I would like to invite Madame Lallemont to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the members of the committee for inviting me and my fellow panelists to speak before you today. The Canadian Council for Refugees is Canada's leading national umbrella representing 200 frontline organizations across the country working with refugees and migrants. For this reason, I will concentrate my remarks on Canada's response and welcoming of refugees. Every year, millions of people are forced to leave their homes due to conflict, violence, human rights violations, persecutions, disasters, and the impacts of climate change. The number of forcibly displaced persons has reached unprecedented heights in 2024. It is now upwards of 122 million people, double what it was a decade ago. Given this unprecedented need for protection, last week Canada made the troubling decision to slash its immigration levels. This included reductions in the number of government-assisted refugees, privately sponsored refugees, and special emergency measures. Shockingly, the number for protected persons and their dependents abroad was cut by 31%, from 29,000 to 20,000. With a current backlog in this category of over 100,000 active applications, the 2025 numbers are signaling that only 1 out of every 5 refugees and family members will get permanent status and be able to move on with their lives. Furthermore, the levels for government-assisted refugees will drop from 23,000 to roughly 15,000. The levels for government-assisted refugees will drop from 23,000 to 15,000. The level for privately sponsored refugees will be reduced by 5,000. Refugees being resettled from overseas often wait more than 3 years for their application to Canada to come to Canada to be processed, and these cuts will mean that refugees will be forced to wait in situations where their lives are at risk on a daily basis. The federal government has framed these cuts in the context of a changing economy. However, Canada has not been immune to a global trend of rising anti-immigrant sentiment and rhetoric which dehumanizes vulnerable migrants. It has been particularly troubling to see the way that refugee claimants have been politicized and incorrectly labeled as a crisis within our country. We know that Canada has a remarkable capacity to resettle and welcome refugees, and ensuring that immigration policies are not overtaken by xenophobic discourses is crucial to ensuring that the federal government continues to plan for adequate levels of humanitarian immigration. I would like to take a moment to highlight concerns that the CCR has included in our call for equity in response to crises. Canadians expect the government to show leadership in providing immigration pathways to people affected by major catastrophes. Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada is currently developing a crisis response framework. This framework must be developed with a consciousness of the long-standing neglect of crises on the African continent. Canada has demonstrated it has the capacity to welcome those displaced from conflict through the measures adopted in response to the situations in Ukraine and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, crises such as the one unfolding in Ethiopia's Tigray region in recent years, for example, have not been met with any special measures. Despite the scale of the crisis currently unfolding in Sudan, media and political attention has been limited, and the emergency response has been a fraction of what has been made available in other situations. Canada's history with colonialism and the effects of systemic racism are reinforced through immigration systems in multiple ways, and these further exacerbate existing marginalizations. The concern for equity and transparency must be at the heart of Canada's crisis response. I will now conclude by speaking briefly to the Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the U.S., which was expanded.
If you could wrap it up, please. Time is out. Wrap it.
Thank you. This agreement has had devastating impacts on tens of thousands of forcibly displaced people seeking protection, and it has not stopped irregular crossings. It has only made them more dangerous and underground. The CCR maintains that this agreement should be withdrawn. And just to very quickly conclude, I would reiterate that the fundamental rights of those fleeing persecution need to be at the center of Canada's concern. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madame Lalemant. And now I would like to invite Mr. Jason Nicholson to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir, je vous remercie de m'avoir invité, Médecins sans frontières, MSF, fournir des soins médicaux humanitaires aux personnes qui ont été forcées de fuir leur foyer à cause de violences, conflits, persécutions et de plus en plus des changements climatiques. Nos équipes fournissent des soins médicaux vitaux à chaque étape du parcours périlleux des personnes déplacées, y compris des soins chirurgicaux, traumatologiques, services de santé maternelle, obstétrique, campagnes de vaccination, activités de santé mentale et approvisionnement en eau potable.
Well, it might be good, except I can't hear the English. So,
Can you check it?
humble too. Are we good now? I think it's good.
Ça va?
I'm not hearing anything now, so.
Yeah. Please.
Okay, thank you. Look, we're at a staggering moment. There's more forcibly displaced people around the world today than at any other time in modern history. Many of the people who are caught in impossible situations of acute and high-intensity violence must flee to survive. Yet, while more people require life-saving humanitarian assistance than ever before, we're also witnessing alarming gaps in responses to large crises of forced displacement. I'm going to speak to you about three specific crises involving forced displacement in Sudan, in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Rohingya crisis, each of which is a distinct crisis, but all are characterized by inadequate global action despite massive humanitarian needs. This April marked 1 year since conflict in Gulf Sudan forcibly displacing millions of people internally and into neighboring countries such as South Sudan and Eastern Chad. Today, the situation is worse than ever. Hundreds of thousands of people are facing immense suffering, including malnutrition, trauma, and a lack of access to basic health care. Earlier this month, MSF was forced to stop outpatient treatment for 5,000 children with acute malnutrition in Zamzam displacement camp in North Darfur because warring parties have blocked deliveries of food, of medicines, and other essential supplies. 2,900 of these children are under the age of 5 with severe acute malnutrition. Their lives are now in immediate danger. Meanwhile, in North Kivu province of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people are urgently in need of food, shelter, drinking water, and protection from sexual violence amid violent conflict between multiple armed groups, including government forces. In 2023, MSF-supported clinics provided care to 20,556 survivors of sexual violence, which is roughly 2 survivors of sexual violence every single hour. This alarming situation has deteriorated further. MSF teams treated nearly 70% of the total number of survivors of sexual violence in 2023 in just the first 5 months of 2024. In September, Eastern DRC was also the epicenter of the current Mpox epidemic in Africa, a virus that will be impossible to contain unless efforts are made to improve the appalling living conditions displaced people have been struggling with for too long. MSF is the main provider of health services inside the fenced Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where roughly 1 million people live. Here, people who have fled violence and persecution today find themselves contained and are prohibited from accessing education or employment. Just this summer, an MSF survey revealed that almost 1 in 5 people tested for hepatitis C had an active infection, but a lack of capacity in the camps means that many Rohingya people are going to miss out on treatment and being cured. 7 years ago, Canada took a leadership role in the global response to the Rohingya crisis. But today, Canada has seemingly failed to renew its Rohingya strategy after it expired in March of 2024. Canada needs to honor the commitment that it made to the Rohingya people and to the humanitarian community and renew and properly resource its strategy immediately. People's lives are further endangered by attempts by states and other actors to contain, deport, and deter people from seeking safety in other countries. Harmful policies do not deter people from fleeing violence and seeking safety, but they do force people into impossible situations, such as making perilous journeys across dangerous seas, where thousands of people routinely die. Canada should not only be responding to these humanitarian and political crises, but should be denouncing policies that prevent people from escaping situations of violence and deprivation, and that increase their vulnerability. I want to thank the committee for taking the time to look into these issues and the role that Canada can play to address these emergencies. In DRC, in Sudan, in Bangladesh, and beyond, minutes matter for people who are forced to flee their homes.
Can you wrap it out, please?
Yep.
Time is up.
And humanitarian assistance can make the difference between life and death. MSF is going to continue to respond, but humanitarians cannot stop wars. Humanitarians cannot lift blockades, and humanitarians cannot prevent the crises that today are driving alarming levels of displacement. You have the voice and power to act decisively. Canada has a voice that needs to be fully engaged in addressing the problems that are today fueling these humanitarian crises. And we hope that Canada can find the political will and the moral courage to continue to step up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nicholson. Thank you for your declaration. And now I would like to open the floor for a question and answer. And I would like to start with Madame Damov. You have the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Dr. Nickerson, it's so nice to see you again. And I want to thank you for the work that you're doing around the world. It's so meaningful and impactful. You mentioned climate change. I'm wondering, would you be able to talk just briefly on how that's impacting what you're seeing in around the world?
Sure. So we think of climate change in many of these crises as a crisis multiplier, and so we're trying to understand and untangle, exactly what this means. But in our projects, there's in some instances very clear medical impacts that climate change is having. So, for example, changing patterns of disease. So in some instances, diseases such as malaria that have a seasonal routine or pattern to them. We're seeing peaks of malaria that are more intense. We're seeing seasonal malaria cases arriving at different times and so on. So climate change, from a medical perspective, in some instances, is changing the patterns of disease and making it more unpredictable. From the perspective of forced migration, I mean, what we do hear from people, in particular people who are dependent on agriculture for livelihoods and so on. If soil becomes unusable, right? I mean, this becomes a bit of a complex integration of multiple things, right? If somebody is dependent on, a climate-sensitive industry for economic viability and they're living in a conflict setting and so on, right? This is multiplying the level of stressors that a person is facing. And so we are hearing in our projects more and more that people are saying that climate is impacting their ability to have, a basic livelihood, and is one of the factors that is contributing to a decision to flee. But that's often layered on top of underlying violence, conflict, and other things as well.
And I guess once they've already fled, it would also cause, I'm thinking of the Rohingya in particular with flooding, so you're in a refugee camp, you hardly have the capacity to deal with flooding, which would in turn lead to more disease in that camp, I would suspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I'm a public health specialist. At the moment, we're responding around the world to more outbreaks of cholera than at any other moment in time. I mean, there's a global stockpile of cholera vaccines that's been depleted for more than 2 years. Some of that is due to market conditions, but it's also largely due to the fact that we're simply seeing more cholera. That's not all entirely dependent on climate change, but some of it certainly is. And so, this is a certain reality that as climate is having an impact, particularly on infectious diseases, when we have outbreaks that occur on top of a refugee crisis or a forced displacement crisis or so on, we're going to run into a lot of different crises that are converging all in one place.
MSF has used the language of a protection gap and then the emergence of the term survival migration. Can you maybe speak to us and explain what that is?
So we're not a protection organization, so I don't think that we're necessarily the best place to fully comment on the protection gaps necessarily. We see this in our medical programs. I mean, the statistics that I mentioned before around more than 20,000 survivors of sexual violence in our clinics. This is how protection gaps present in MSF programming. This is what we see. We see people who are victimized, people who have been assaulted and injured and who are in need of medical care as a result of the failure of protection systems to adequately protect them.
The previous witness, I don't know if you heard her talk from Oxfam, was talking about the increasing impact on women. My colleague also mentioned that. Are you seeing in the people that you're dealing with a change in demographics in who is fleeing?
I think I want to be cautious about making general assumptions about hundreds of millions of people, because every crisis is quite different. The conditions that lead somebody to flee are going to be quite different, and so on. We consistently see that women and children are among the most vulnerable in any humanitarian crisis around the world. However, I think we also need to recognize that gender plays a significant role in these crises, and in some instances we see men, for example, who might be specifically targeted because they are men. But the result of that is that we see more women in our programming who are fleeing and who are in need of medical care. But the short answer is yes. I mean, these vulnerabilities are very real. This is why, as from a public health perspective and somebody who's worked in doing needs assessments and so on, it's very important to understand, who is standing in line at the clinic and, is there a significant gender disparity in there and why does that exist and so on. And, making sure that programs are adequately identifying people who are most vulnerable and most in need and targeting specific strategies to reach them.
I was in Costa Rica this summer and went to a migrant shelter. And one of the things that I learned when I was there is they're seeing more families. Part of these, it used to be just men that were fleeing. It's now whole families. And the impact on long-term mental health impact on those kids. I mean, are you seeing that in your work? I recognize that every country is different, and I don't know if you're working in Central America or not.
Programming throughout Central America. The other witness has been an expert in protection issues and maybe has something to add. But I mean, certainly we're providing quite comprehensive primary health care. We're seeing a huge need for people to, receive quite basic primary health care as they're fleeing whatever situation of violence. We're seeing massive mental health needs. People have been exposed to very high levels of violence. To your point, certainly it's families, it's women, it's children. We see a full sort of family unit in many of these programs.
And I've run out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
She's on time. Nice. First one on time.
I'd like to invite Mr. Majumdar to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'd like to keep it tight if that's possible. So first of all, Alexander Waxman, thank you for tabling your full report, your initial introductory remarks. I'll look forward to reviewing them in detail. Before coming back to you, Emmanuel Rincon, I wanted to talk to you about Edmundo Gonzalez. The failure to recognize him as a legitimate Venezuelan leader, you indicated in your testimony, comes at a cost, a direct cost on how refugees are weaponized. Would you take just a minute to describe how weaponizing immigration is a tool that dictators like Maduro use to destabilize the region and entrench their hold on power?
Yes, thank you. In fact, only the past month, in the month of September, the migration through the Darien, that is a gap that is in Panama, that the people are using to go to the United States, has increased in 60% since Maduro stole the election, and the countries of the world are like denying the real results that the opposition has shown. So right now what we have is a major crisis, because in the United States, Maduro is throwing away some people that were in the jail. These are the criminal gang Tren de Aragua. And those people are like hiding between normal people that are trying to migrate, and they are getting inside of our neighbor's country. It's happening right now in Peru, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Chile, and also in the United States. And maybe can happen in the future to Canada too. And the thing is that these people are right now like robbing, they are killing people. They are in the past week, they also have been taking like real estate departments, and they are figuring out to kidnap all those properties, and they are really making a mess in all the region. So that is a big mess. And as I was saying at the first, I think that the developed countries has the mission not only to provide a shelter to the people, but to fight to democracy in all the hemisphere. I mean, I think that the mission of Canada has to be to try to get democracy in our countries, not try to bring all the people, all the refugees to their country, because that is what the dictator wants.
Thank you very much for that. It's often a misnomer that policies of appeasement might abate a refugee crisis when instead it enhances it. So I appreciate that. Mr. Waxman, you've had 12 years of practitioner-grade experience across the world. In your testimony, I was struck with just how broken the international refugee system has become. I know that there are a lot of calls for accountability, for more efficient delivery of services, to simplify ways in which refugees can access services. Do you have some suggestions of things that you have seen that actually focus on accomplishing that accountability in the UN system?
Within the UN system, so thank you for the question. It's a good one. I haven't actually seen anything within the UN system other than really sort of almost spreading out the need to conduct. So I'll speak specifically to refugee status determination, which is the process by which an asylum seeker, a person who's crossed an international boundary, is saying, you know, I fear that I cannot go back to my country of origin. Well, you got to prove that. And so somebody's got to basically, for better or worse, interrogate you as to where you're from and then figure out whether or not you meet the convention grounds. So that system in itself is weak. Because the threshold for proof, the burden of proof, is the lowest possible threshold. It's not a criminal standard. It's not a civil standard. The benefit of the doubt is given to the claimant. Okay, so whatever the claimant says, the interviewing officer simply has to accept it at its face value, more or less. Once the interview is done, he or she then goes to a series of reports, whether it's by Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. Those are often recycled reports. So I'll just pick something let's say an ongoing conflict in Somalia or something like that. You have to prove that you're from South Central Somalia. Well, how do I really know as an interviewing officer that you're from South Central Somalia? You could actually be a Kenyan Somalian posing as somebody from South Central Somalia. You just need to know a few facts. You speak the same language. You speak that off Somali. You prove verbally that you're from a clan structure, which I simply just have on a sheet that's printed out in, English for me. And then if that person has been coached to read from just a few lines of a Human Rights Watch report or Amnesty International, bing, they cannot be returned or refooled, and therefore they then go into the pipeline for resettlement. So I never saw anything within the UNHCR system to do that. And on top of that, I also saw reforms, so-called reforms within UNHCR, to then offshoot RSD from their own RSD unit to other agencies, like the Danish Refugee Council, for example. Yeah.
I'm going to turn my time to my colleague, MP Lake. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Just to follow up on that, actually, sure. I'm interested in that when you take a look at the overwhelming numbers that we've heard today, and you take the context of what you're saying, think about people who actually meet the standard, the truly most vulnerable people in the world. What is the cost to them of an inefficient bureaucratic system that isn't focused?
Huge amounts of waiting time. They probably might try to, if I worked in India, where some people can wait 2-3 years after an interview to see whether they got refugee status. India is a non-signatory to the Refugee Convention. It's one of the few countries. So they're vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation within India. They can themselves become irregular movers. They can resort to smuggling, try their luck in another country or another situation, that sort of thing. So that's a huge risk.
And we've heard a few witnesses today talk about democracy, governance. Only have a short period of time. So, Jason, I'd love to go to you, but I probably won't have time. So I'll stick with Alexander. Governance, democracy, in terms of keeping the number of migrants down, taking a look at where things are moving, where the potential hotspots are. I imagine future migration issues could be avoided by working with governments, democratically elected governments like the one in Venezuela, supporting the legitimately elected folks in Venezuela.
I'm sorry, time is out, Mr.
Okay, so may I answer? Is there no room for an answer?
We passed it on 5:30. I have two others to pass. Sorry.
Okay.
Vous avez la parole pour 7 minutes.
7 minutes. The floor is
for everyone.
No problem. I'm first-time participant, so thank you for schooling me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. We get used to it. Now, Mr. Nicholson, in your opening remarks, you targeted 3 crises, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Rohingyas. I'm not an expert, you are. However, I get the sense that those 3 conflicts don't necessarily have that much in common. Now, from a Canadian standpoint, what about the funding of humanitarian aid? the UN has been calling on Canada for years to contribute a higher amount of the GDP in humanitarian assistance. I think we're at 0.9 of 1%. We're lower than Stephen Harper's levels. The Liberals said that they were going to increase those levels, and yet we're under Stephen Harper's threshold in terms of a GDP contribution. Does that affect your role on the ground at MSF?
Je vais te répondre en anglais.
I'll respond in English.
Okay, so there's a few points to make here. The first is that I think we've heard several times today that humanitarian needs are extraordinarily high. I believe the UN estimate is that there's 300 million people who are in need of life-saving humanitarian assistance and who are covered by a humanitarian response plan. So the impact that this has on Médecins Sans Frontières is in a number of different ways. The first is that we are responding to a very large number of humanitarian crises in roughly 70 different countries. I mean, we did 16.5 million outpatient consultations in our programs last year. So the needs are very, very high. On the humanitarian funding question specifically, I want to emphasize that we're a largely privately funded humanitarian organization. Canada is, in fact, one of only 3 government donors that we apply for funding from. So we're largely privately funded, which allows us to respond very quickly when emergencies happen. But the fact of the matter is that the humanitarian system is stretched. I mean, there are huge needs that are going completely unmet. Some of that is an efficiency problem and other things. But some of it, very honestly, is simply a lack of funding. In the Rohingya crisis, for example, World Food Program rations are down to $10 per person per month. This is simply a funding shortfall in many of the crises around the world.
Oui, c'est effrayant, en effet, lorsque vous nous donnez ces chiffres-là. Je suis content que les analystes prennent ça en note. Vous avez aussi parlé du rôle du Canada. Vous avez dit, là, je vous cite de ce que vous avez dit, le Canada a échoué dans les dernières années par rapport à son rôle de leader.
Has failed in its leadership role. Now, we're talking about humanitarian aid, peace building, human rights. Now, those 3 crises have something in common. Personally speaking, I haven't seen Canada taken the necessary action to have a very credible voice on the world stage in those 3 specific countries.
I'll start with the Rohingya crisis because I actually think that this is a very good example of a crisis where Canada stood up and showed significant leadership. Canada in 2017, at the outset of this crisis, appointed Bob Rae as the special envoy on the Rohingya crisis. There was a report that was generated, there was recommendations, and so on. This was significant not only because of those actions, but because the political capital that it mobilized at a high level, I think, empowered Canada to take action at country level in Bangladesh, where there was actually quite a bit of significant advocacy that happened on behalf of the humanitarian response and on behalf of the Rohingya people, and that permeated into other countries as well. There was actually a lot of very, very good work that happened under Canada's Rohingya strategy, and unfortunately that wasn't specifically renewed in the budget. We think that it should have been, and that work needs to continue. Now, I mention it because I actually think that it's a very helpful reminder that Canada can take on some of these crises and show significant leadership. I'm not saying that a special envoy is always going to be the solution and so on, but having high-level political endorsement of a Canadian response that mobilizes, yes, humanitarian funding, but also Canada's diplomatic efforts and humanitarian advocacy and humanitarian policy and so on can be very effective when all of these resources are put to work in response to a crisis. But simply funding the humanitarian response is not enough to actually address the underlying problems that create it, or the myriad of problems that come along, as organizations are trying to respond and negotiate access and so on, particularly in violent conflicts.
Now, The third thing, I think I still have some time left. The third thing, and again, I'm not an expert, you're the expert, but there is perhaps a common link between these three countries. I spoke about funding and Canada's leadership role or lack thereof, but there's also the issue of mediation. Now, folks here in Canada and Quebec, I go to Lac Saint-Jean each and every week. There's a lack of media coverage, and people have their everyday affairs to go about, and economic issues, social issues, but this is one of the worst humanitarian crises worldwide, and we just don't hear much about it. Perhaps that's not the Government of Canada's role. Perhaps there's an issue with a lack of media coverage, or perhaps politicians are falling short in some way in terms of not bringing these issues to the table and bringing them to the media's attention. Perhaps I'm completely off base with my analysis.
It's very challenging to draw attention to neglected crises. I mean, we talk about what we see in DRC, in the Rohingya camps, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, in Sudan, in Chad, in South Sudan, and so on. It's very difficult to get media attention.
Very quickly, I know I don't have much time left, but now, crises like Ukraine, the Gaza Strip, we hear about each and every day. Do they overshadow what the crises you've referred to?
I think yes, but the needs are also very high in these crises. But just quickly on your second point, it's absolutely essential that members of Parliament are speaking about the neglected crises and trying to find a useful role for Canada in responding to these crises. So yes, I think we as humanitarian organizations have a responsibility to try and push this into the public dialogue and into the media and so on. But parliamentarians as well have a very clear responsibility to be talking about it, whether it's at committee or in statements in Parliament or somewhere else.
Thank you, Dr. Jason. Thank you. I invite Mr. John to take the floor.
Well, again, I just wanted to extend my appreciation for the work that you're doing and your important testimony today. We heard Mr. Brunel Duceppe talk about the decline in aid from Canada. You talked about, Dr. Nickerson, about 300 million people in literally a life-saving requirement situation, the most ever in history. And here, Canada right now, we've heard from Ms. Lallement, and I'm going to give her a chance to speak a bit about it, but she raised concerns about the government's plan to actually reduce immigration levels at a time like this, and certainly as well as, we're seeing rising anti-immigration sentiment around the world here in Canada. And the Migrant Rights Network have just published an open letter to the Minister of Immigration and to our own Prime Minister on this issue, which has been endorsed by 143 organizations so far. And a portion of the letter reads, quote, "Migrants are not responsible for Canada's housing crisis, lack of jobs, or inadequate healthcare or other public services. They often live in some of the worst housing situations, face extreme exploitation at work, and are denied access to basic services. And recent media coverage and public statements linking them to the affordability crisis are distractions from decades of federal and provincial policies that have underfunded and privatized public services, and reductions to migration numbers lean into these xenophobic ideas, eroding public confidence in immigration policies and resulting in greater racism," end quote. So, Ms. Lallement, do you agree that refugees and migrants are being scapegoated right now by policy failures, and what can be done to counter that narrative?
Thank you very much for your question. So we have at different moments tried to address what we consider very troubling actions on the part of both federal and provincial leaders about the ways that they speak about both migrants, but also in some cases international students, and linking them to different affordability crises that you mentioned. So just to note that during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Canada was not accepting when our land borders were effectively closed, we had some of the largest increases in housing prices. So this is a very clear indication that actually it does not have anything to do with what kind of, the numbers of migrants arriving. These are longstanding social structural issues. So what we do encourage policymakers and media to do are to really question the kinds of linkages and narratives that are being pushed and ensure that they are not falling into traps of, either talking points of right-wing groups or backlash that we're seeing, more widely across, lots of different countries towards migrants and especially racialized people. So I really think that there is a role for government officials to be closely watching how they speak about these very vulnerable populations, and also ensuring that the media is not unnecessarily reproducing these narratives, even just to report on them.
Thank you. I really appreciate my friend and colleague, Ms. Damoff, talking about mental health supports. And Dr. Nickerson, maybe you can speak about the mental health impacts of forced displacement on populations like children and who are obviously more vulnerable to those impacts. And maybe you can also add about how difficult it is for displaced persons to access trauma-informed mental health care.
Sure. So mental health programming has really become a core aspect of our humanitarian medical response. I mean, when you're inside of a high-intensity armed conflict, people are exposed to a tremendous level of violence. It's unpredictable. It's often indiscriminate. People are exposed to very high levels of psychological stress, and they're in need of mental health assistance and support. There continues to be huge gaps in this kind of programming, and I would also say as well for more severe mental health disorders and psychiatric conditions, there's almost little to no aspect of that's included in many humanitarian responses. So there's a very significant need. In terms of trauma-informed responses, I mean, this is exactly how we're implementing, a package of psychosocial care. And I would say that, it is a really important aspect that I think needs to be considered. Like, we're a medical humanitarian organization. We integrate these things into our programming, and particularly for a service package such as sexual and gender-based violence care, there's the medical response, there's the psychosocial response, which we provide as a comprehensive package, but then people also continue to need access to legal assistance, they need housing, they need shelter, they need protection, and so on. And so, I think that there's really a need to consider the full sort of suite of services that people need in these kinds of acute humanitarian crises.
Sure, and I think you touched on it. I mean, it's an ongoing thing. Rebuilding their lives, they're going to need help through that process. But what can be done to build capacity for psychological first aid on the migration routes and in those host countries as for those displaced people?
I'm not sure that I can give you a fully comprehensive answer, but it's not my area of expertise. But I'd be happy to submit some additional information on that to the committee.
Mr. Waxman, I think you were kind of itching to add to it.
Well, I could just quickly touch it, and I can speak from, for example, UNICEF's standpoint. They do things like child-friendly spaces, so anybody under 18, they're often, they're like play spaces, so it's like play between kids and things like that is used as sort of a psychological stress release rather than individual one-on-one type of counseling. So that it's sort of that sort of triage level type of stuff. So they are quite specialized in that, and they have things called education kits, EIE kits, like literally metal boxes and child play kits and stuff like that. So those are actually one of the more useful things that are done en route and in IDP or refugee style things. Over to you. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. John. Thanks for all our witnesses. Thank you for your participation in this important study. Thank you for your testimony. If you feel you have other information to share with the committee, feel free to write to the clerk. Is the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Meeting adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.